Evan Carlisle wasn't planning to stop, until the crash, the children, and one name changed everything. The city had just begun to settle into the quiet rhythm of evening when Evan Carlisle's black sedan rolled along the edge of the highway, its tinted windows catching the last orange flickers of a fading sunset. The sky had darkened into streaks of deep purple and steel blue, and the air outside was heavy with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Evan, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit and crisp white shirt, sat in the back seat reading through a tablet full of contracts and restaurant expansion figures. His mind was firmly locked into work, where it always was. Numbers didn't lie. Deadlines didn't disappoint. They were easier than people, and far easier than feelings. He didn't notice the traffic slowing until the car jerked to a gradual stop. He looked up. Red and blue lights flashed ahead in frantic bursts, cutting across the darkening road. His driver turned down the volume of the radio and leaned toward the windshield. "Looks like there's been an accident," he murmured. "Should we take the next exit?" But something in Evan's chest tightened unexpectedly. There was no clear reason for it. Just a strange, unsettled feeling in his gut, like a whisper he couldn't quite hear. "No," he said slowly. "Pull over. I want to see." The driver hesitated for a moment, surprised. Evan Carlisle didn't usually involve himself in anything unplanned. But he nodded and pulled the car toward the shoulder. As soon as they came to a full stop, Evan stepped out into the cold evening air. The sounds hit him at once: sirens, the low murmur of emergency responders, and the distant cries of someone in pain. A twisted SUV sat crumpled against the guardrail, its front end smashed inward, glass shattered across the pavement. Firemen were working with crowbars and cutters. One paramedic shouted for a stretcher. Another stood nearby, shaking his head grimly. Evan took a few steps forward. One of the EMTs turned and recognized his suit immediately. "Sir, it's not safe, please stay back." But Evan's eyes had already found something. A woman was being lifted into an ambulance on a stretcher, unconscious, with oxygen tubes secured to her face. Her dark hair was matted with blood, and her body was unnaturally still. He had no idea who she was. Not yet. But it was the way the paramedic spoke next that made his heart stop. "We've got 3 more still trapped in the back, kids. We need backup. Fast." "Children?" Evan repeated, almost breathless. "They're still inside?" The man nodded quickly. "Back seat. The front end took the worst of it, but they're wedged in. We've got 1 crew on the mother already. She's critical." Without thinking, Evan stepped around the wreck. "Let me in," he said, his voice low, but steady. "I'm going in." The EMT opened his mouth to object, but something in Evan's tone, or maybe in his eyes, made him pause. Seconds later, Evan was kneeling beside the mangled door. The metal was hot and sharp where the headlights still burned. He ducked inside, ignoring the sting of glass against his palms, and peered into the back. 3 small bodies were curled against each other. Seatbelts still strapped. Eyes wide. Not crying. Not moving. Just watching him. "Hey," Evan said softly. "It's okay. I'm going to help you." The first girl he reached had a scrape on her cheek and blonde curls damp with sweat and blood. She stared at him, unblinking. He unbuckled her carefully and pulled her out through the side, shielding her head from the twisted metal. A fireman took her from his arms. He went back in. The second one whimpered but didn't scream. Her hand grabbed his wrist as he lifted her. The third girl was so still he panicked for a second until she turned her head and looked at him with those same pale blue eyes, eyes that made his breath catch. They were identical. Triplets. Around 5 years old. Light blonde hair, small frames, matching faces. He carried the last one out and set her gently onto a waiting gurney. And then he stood there, heart racing, hands shaking, staring at them. They didn't cry. They didn't ask for their mother. They only looked at him, 3 sets of matching blue eyes, searching his face, as if they recognized something he didn't yet understand. He stepped back as the ambulances pulled away, one after another, sirens screaming into the dusk. "Are you coming?" one of the medics called to him from the open door of the last vehicle. Evan hesitated. Then nodded. "Yes," he said. "I'm going with them." He didn't know their names. He didn't know their story. But something in his chest was breaking open, slow and strange and impossible to ignore. And he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not from them. The fluorescent lights in the emergency department cast a pale, artificial glow over every surface as Evan paced the waiting area, the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. His jacket was still draped over his arm, hands stained with flecks of dried blood and dirt, but he didn't notice. Time had dissolved into something shapeless since he arrived. He wasn't sure if it had been minutes or hours since the ambulance doors had closed behind him. The hospital had taken the girls in immediately, each rushed into separate pediatric trauma bays, their injuries labeled as minor but not insignificant. The mother, however, had been taken elsewhere, deeper into the ICU, her condition marked unstable before Evan could even ask for details. He stood silently now at the edge of the nurse's station, waiting, watching, trying to make sense of the images still playing in his head, the twisted metal, the silence of the children, and most of all, their eyes. There was something about the way they had looked at him. Not with fear or confusion, but with eerie calm. As if something in them had already accepted what had happened. As if they'd already survived more than any child should. Eventually, a woman in blue scrubs stepped up to him, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Carlyle?" she asked, her voice gentle but measured. He nodded immediately. "The girls are stable," she said. "They're being kept overnight for observation. A few cuts and bruises, one has a mild concussion, but they're going to be fine physically." Evan's chest eased slightly, but only for a moment. "And the mother?" he asked. The nurse hesitated, and that hesitation spoke volumes. "She's in surgery," she said. "Internal bleeding. Head trauma. It's serious, but the doctors are doing everything they can." Evan nodded slowly, then ran a hand down his face. "Can I see the girls?" "They're asleep now," she said. "They've been through a lot. But they asked about you before they dozed off." He looked up sharply. "About me? What did they say?" The nurse offered a small smile. "They asked if the man who carried them out was still here. Said he felt familiar." Evan swallowed hard. "Do you know their names?" She checked her clipboard. "Evelyn, Aria, and Alexa Hardy." They were listed under the mother's emergency contact. Evan froze. His world tilted. That name, Hardy, hit him like a blow. His mind reeled as the nurse continued talking, but her words faded into the background. Hardy. Malin Hardy. He hadn't heard her name in 6 years. 6 years ago, they'd been inseparable for a time. He had been just starting to grow his business, bouncing between cities, stressed and ambitious, while she worked part-time in a bakery and painted on the side. She had been light to his shadow. Laughter when he was pressure. Warmth in a world of competition. And then, just like that, he left. A promotion came. A new market opened. And he told himself he had no room in his life for anything messy. They didn't fight. She didn't beg. She just let him go. He had never known she was pregnant. The realization hit him like a freight train, heavy and violent. His knees nearly gave out, and he steadied himself against the counter. The nurse gave him a concerned glance. "Do you know her?" she asked. "Yes," he whispered. "A long time ago." He didn't explain further. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, hands trembling now. Within minutes, he had called his assistant, Tom. "I need a background check on a Malin Hardy," he said in a low, urgent voice. "And I need a DNA test." Quietly. Discreetly. Through private labs only. Tom, ever efficient, didn't ask why. He simply replied, "Understood," and hung up. Evan sat down in the waiting room, hands clasped together, elbows on his knees. All at once, the carefully structured world he had spent years building began to crack. The sterile empire, the neatly organized schedule, the loneliness he never acknowledged, all of it felt suddenly thin. Fragile. Meaningless. What if they really were his? He stared at the floor for a long time, trying to remember every moment with Malin, every word, every missed sign. Guilt crashed over him in waves. Not just for leaving her, but for what these girls, his daughters, maybe, had endured without him. What kind of father had he unknowingly failed to be? Eventually, the nurse returned with a small gesture. "One of them woke up for a moment," she said. She asked if her mommy was okay. Evan looked up, his chest tightening. "What did you say?" he asked. "I told her she's getting the best care possible," she said gently. "And that the man who saved them is still here." Evan stood slowly. "Will you tell them? I'll be here when they wake up." The nurse nodded. "Of course." And as she walked away, Evan moved to a nearby chair and sat down again, this time with purpose. He wasn't going anywhere. Not tonight. Not until he knew the truth. Not until he saw those eyes again, not because they haunted him, but because some part of him, deep down, already knew they belonged to him. By morning, the sun had begun to rise over the hospital, casting soft golden light across the windows of the pediatric wing. Evan hadn't slept. He sat in the same chair outside the girls' room, his back stiff, his mind wired, the coffee in his hands long since gone cold. The night had passed in quiet waves, nurses moving in and out, machines softly beeping behind closed doors, his own thoughts circling like restless birds. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them again, three identical faces looking at him from the wreckage, silent and steady, as if waiting for him to realize something he still hadn't fully grasped. He rose from his chair and approached the window of the girls' room. Inside, the triplets slept, curled under identical white blankets, their hair brushed neatly and their faces pale but peaceful. The sight of them, so small and still, did something to his chest that he couldn't explain. He didn't just feel responsible for them, he felt tethered to them in a way that defied logic. Evelyn, Aria, and Alexa. The names felt unfamiliar on his tongue, but the girls themselves did not. A quiet knock pulled him from his thoughts. It was Tom, his assistant, arriving with a manila envelope and a tension in his posture that said everything Evan needed to know. "It's them," Tom said quietly, handing over the papers. The DNA matched. All three. There's no doubt. Evan took the envelope without opening it. His fingers trembled slightly around the edges. "Malin? She's still in critical condition. They're keeping her sedated until her vitals stabilize. The doctors think she has a chance, but it's a slow road. No guarantees." Evan nodded and dismissed Tom with a quiet thank you, not trusting himself to say more. After he was alone again, he finally sat down and opened the envelope. The printed reports, stamped and notarized, told him what his gut had known since the moment he looked into those blue eyes: they were his. Every single piece of evidence laid out in those pages screamed a truth that would now change the rest of his life. He was a father. He stood and walked slowly back toward the girls' room. One of the nurses, a kind woman named Kara, saw him approaching and gently gestured that the girls were beginning to stir. Evan hesitated in the doorway. Then he stepped inside. The smallest one, Alexa, he thought, blinked first. Her eyes opened slowly, and when they landed on him, she didn't flinch. She just watched. Moments later, the other two began to shift, turning in their beds until 3 pairs of identical blue eyes were trained on him. None of them spoke right away. There was a silence that felt impossibly full, like something unspoken was already moving between them. Finally, Arya sat up a little and asked in a quiet voice, "Are you the man who saved us?" Evan swallowed. "Yes," he said. "I was there." "Why did you help us?" asked Evelyn, her voice more wary. He stepped closer, careful not to alarm them, and knelt down beside their beds. "Because you were in danger. And because I think I was meant to be there." The girls looked at each other, and then back at him. Then Alexa tilted her head and asked the question he dreaded and hoped for all at once. "Do you know our mommy?" Evan felt the breath leave his body. He nodded slowly. "Yes. I do. Her name is Malin Hardy. I knew her a long time ago." There was another long pause. Then Evelyn whispered, "She said our daddy was far away. That he was busy. But nice." Evan's voice broke slightly as he replied. "I didn't know. About you. About any of it. If I had, I wouldn't have stayed away." Arya leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "So, are you our dad?" He didn't look away. He didn't hedge. "Yes," he said quietly. "I am." And with that, the silence broke. Alexa's lower lip trembled. Evelyn turned her face into the pillow. Arya blinked and asked, "Is mommy going to die?" The question pierced him like a blade. He shook his head, forcing calm into his voice. "She's very sick. But the doctors are taking care of her. And I'm going to stay here. With you. Every day." The girls didn't cry loudly. They didn't panic. But their tears came, silent and slow, and Evan sat beside them and let them take his hands. One in each. 3 little palms that gripped tightly, desperately, like they already understood that they had lost too much, and couldn't lose more. That night, Evan didn't leave the hospital. He arranged for a private suite in the pediatric wing. He brought in books, toys, warm blankets. He sat on the floor and helped them draw. He told them stories about when he was a boy, how he used to be afraid of thunderstorms, how he once burned toast so badly the fire alarm went off. He didn't know how to be a father. But he knew how to be present. How to show up. How to make a promise and keep it. And by the time the girls fell asleep again, this time with him sitting beside them on a fold-out chair with their fingers still tangled in his, Evan Carlyle understood that his life was no longer about boardrooms or business expansions. It was about these 3 little hearts, and the mother fighting for hers just down the hall. The ICU was unnaturally quiet when Evan stepped into its waiting lounge. The walls were painted in soft shades of gray and blue, and the lights were dimmed as if to protect the fragility of the lives hanging in balance just behind the thick hospital doors. It had been 5 days since the accident, and Malin had not woken up. Every day, Evan checked in with the nurses, asked for updates from the doctors, sat outside her room even when there was nothing new to learn. He had visited the girls every morning and every night, making sure they felt safe, fed, and loved, but a piece of him remained here, stuck in the sterile, tense air of this hallway, waiting for the woman who once made his world feel full to open her eyes again. He had asked for access to sit with her privately. The hospital allowed him limited time, based on his relationship to the children and the nature of the situation. No one questioned him directly, not after the DNA test, not after the staff had seen how the girls clung to him, not after they saw how he stayed every night instead of returning to his penthouse across the city. He could have sent a nanny or hired a private caregiver. But he didn't. He couldn't. When the nurse opened the door to Malin's room and gave him a nod, he stepped in slowly. Machines hummed softly, and the beep of her heart monitor echoed gently through the space. She looked so small in the bed, her frame swallowed by hospital blankets, her face pale and still. Bandages wrapped around her forehead, and an oxygen tube rested beneath her nose. Her dark hair had been brushed back neatly, though a few strands clung to her cheeks. She hadn't moved since the day of the crash. Evan sat down beside her and let out a long, quiet breath. He reached out and took her hand, cool, thin, and familiar in a way that felt like time had collapsed. "It's me," he said softly. "I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know if I deserve to be the one sitting here. But I'm here." He looked at her hand, then at her face, and the guilt that had been tightening in his chest for days finally spilled out. "You should have told me, May. You should have called. Written. Anything. But I know / I know why you didn't. Because I left. Because I made you believe you didn't matter enough. And now I'm here, sitting in this room like some stranger who's trying to piece together a family that already existed without him." He paused, his voice cracking. "They're amazing, May. Evelyn is sharp and serious, she watches everything. Aria is soft, but she asks questions that cut right through you. Alexa, she's the wild one. Always moving, always smiling, even when she's scared. And they're yours. Everything good in them, I know it came from you." He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, still holding her hand. "They know who I am now. I told them. I couldn't lie. I didn't want to. But I don't know how to do this without you. They need you, May. And I think I do too." There was no movement from her, no flicker of eyelids, no change in the rhythm of the monitors. But he stayed there, his hand wrapped around hers, until a nurse quietly stepped in and reminded him it was time to go. Later that night, back in the pediatric suite, the girls were already in their pajamas when Evan returned. They ran to him immediately, still unsure whether they should hug him or hold back. Evan knelt and opened his arms, and all three pressed into his chest without hesitation. He held them like they were the most delicate things in the world, which they were. "Did you see Mommy today?" Aria asked, her voice small. Evan nodded. "She's still resting. But I talked to her." "Did she talk back?" Alexa asked, hopeful. "Not yet," he answered. "But I think she's listening." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes steady. "If she doesn't wake up, will we still stay with you?" The question struck him so deeply he almost couldn't breathe. He nodded slowly, wrapping them tighter. "Yes," he said. "No matter what. You're mine now. Forever." That night, after the girls were asleep, Evan stood alone on the hospital balcony just outside their wing, the cool spring air brushing against his face. He looked up at the stars barely visible through the haze of city lights. He thought about the man he had been 6 years ago, the one who left without looking back. That man was gone. What remained was someone trying to be worthy of 3 daughters he hadn't even known existed, and a woman who had once loved him enough to raise them alone. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time, he knew what he wanted. He wanted this family. He wanted to earn it. And he would wait as long as it took for May to come back, to look at him, and to see not the man who left, but the one who finally stayed. The hospital was beginning to feel like a second home. Evan had memorized the layout of every corridor, every vending machine location, and which nurses worked which shifts. He knew what time the sunlight hit the window in the girls' room and when the hallways turned quiet enough to hear the soft hum of machines behind every door. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the accident, and while the girls had begun to settle into a routine, Malin had not woken up. Every day Evan visited her ICU room, and every day she lay still, unchanged except for the slow, stable beeping of the monitors that told him she was still fighting. He had spoken to her doctors multiple times. They said she was stable but unresponsive. Her brain had suffered trauma, swelling that was now subsiding, but no one could predict when she might regain consciousness. Or if. Still, they encouraged Evan to talk to her, to keep speaking like she could hear him. And he did, without fail, even when he had nothing left to say but silence. The girls were adapting faster than he expected, though their grief showed in quiet ways. Aveline had stopped asking about her mother every day. Instead, she now clung to routine, brushing her hair precisely, folding her pajamas, lining up her shoes next to the bed. Arya had become more withdrawn, often staring out the window as if watching for something that might never come. Alexa, the most expressive of the three, asked hard questions at bedtime, questions like, "Why did Mommy drive that day?" and, "Are you going to leave too?" Evan never avoided their questions. He answered the best he could, with honesty and patience, but it shook him how much pain they carried so quietly. One night, while tucking them in, Alexa turned toward him and whispered, "I think she's dreaming. That's why she won't wake up." Evan swallowed hard and nodded. "Maybe she is," he said. "And maybe she's trying to find her way back." It was that same night he got the call from the ICU. He was halfway through reading a storybook when his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. The number flashed and he knew before answering. His heart beat wildly as he stepped into the hallway. The voice on the other end was calm, but excited. Malin had opened her eyes. Briefly. She hadn't spoken, but her gaze was responsive, and she had squeezed the nurse's hand. Evan didn't even say goodbye. He just ran. By the time he reached her room, her eyes were closed again, but the nurse smiled. "It's happening," she said gently. "She's surfacing. It might take time, but she's waking up." Evan approached the bed slowly, his breath shallow, his mind full of everything he had wanted to say. He took her hand, just as he had every day, and leaned close. "May," he said softly, "it's me. Evan. The girls are okay. They're safe. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The faintest flicker moved across her brow, and her fingers shifted against his palm. Over the next few days, her recovery became gradual but clear. She opened her eyes more often. She followed voices. She blinked in response to questions. Finally, one morning, her lips parted, and a single word came out, soft, slurred, but unmistakable. "Girls." Evan felt his throat tighten as he bent closer. "They're okay. They miss you. They ask about you every night." Her gaze drifted to him. Recognition dawned slowly, like light rising over the edge of a hill. "You came back," she said, her voice barely audible. He nodded, eyes burning. "Yes. I should have never left." She didn't scold him. She didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes again, but this time with a look of peace on her face, as if some part of her had finally let go of the fear she'd carried alone for years. That afternoon, Evan returned to the girls' room and told them the news. They stared at him for a long second, unsure whether to believe it. Then all three launched into him at once, arms wrapping around his torso, tears spilling down their cheeks, laughter and sobs mixing into a sound so raw and pure it brought him to his knees. That night, none of them wanted separate beds. They all curled up together in one hospital bed, limbs tangled, hearts beating fast, and Evan sat nearby in the chair, watching them sleep, knowing that for the first time, the world had given them back something instead of taking it away. And he knew deep in his bones that everything was about to change, but not in the way it had before. This time, it would be a change born of healing. Of reunion. Of a family finally coming home. The room was filled with soft afternoon light when Malin sat up for the first time without assistance. A nurse had adjusted the bed, and Evan was at her side, his hand hovering close in case she swayed. But she didn't. Her back was straight, her expression focused, though her body was still fragile. She looked thinner, as if weeks of silence had stripped weight not only from her frame but from the years she'd carried alone. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, but her voice had grown stronger with each passing day, and now her mind was fully present. The fog had lifted, and with it came clarity, and questions. For the first few days of her waking recovery, neither of them had spoken in detail about the past. Their conversations were simple. How the girls were doing. What they liked to eat. What books they liked read aloud before sleep. Evan had avoided pushing, giving her time to find her footing. But on this day, sitting beside her in the quiet room, she turned her head and looked at him with eyes that had not changed in all the years they'd been apart. "I guess I should have told you," she said quietly. "Back then." Evan exhaled, his fingers tightening around the edge of the chair. "I should have asked. Or stayed. Or something. Anything." She gave him a soft, tired smile. "We were young. You were building something. I didn't want to be the reason you stopped." "You wouldn't have been," he said immediately, his voice hoarse. "I just didn't know how to be two things at once. I thought love would slow me down. That needing someone made me weaker. But I was wrong. I didn't know it until I saw them. And I looked in their eyes and saw myself staring back." Malin lowered her gaze. "It was hard. Raising them alone. But it wasn't bitterness that kept me quiet. I told myself if they ever met you, I wanted it to be because you found them, not because I brought them to your doorstep like proof." "You never needed to prove anything to me," Evan said. "They're brilliant. Strong. Brave. Everything I never deserved but want to fight for now." For a moment, silence settled between them again, but it wasn't heavy. It was reflective. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small, folded drawing. She opened it slowly. It was a crayon sketch by Alexa, 3 girls holding hands with a tall man in the middle, all of them smiling under a giant sun. In shaky handwriting at the bottom, it read, "Our family." Malin stared at it for a long time. Then her fingers pressed it gently to her chest. "They've been through so much. And you were there when they needed someone most." "I'm not going anywhere now," Evan said. "I want to be there for every day that comes next. Not just for them, but for you too." Malin looked at him, and for the first time, tears filled her eyes. But they weren't of fear or pain, they were of release. Of years of tension breaking, of loneliness being replaced by something she had almost forgotten how to trust. Later that evening, Evan brought the girls into her room. They entered shyly at first, as if afraid she might still vanish before their eyes. But when she opened her arms, all 3 ran to her without hesitation. They wrapped themselves around her like they were trying to become part of her again, their tears silent and fierce. She held them all, kissed their heads, whispered their names over and over, and when her eyes met Evan's over their shoulders, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't a promise. It was something stronger. A beginning. That night, the 5 of them sat in the hospital room eating takeout from a paper bag. Arya was perched on the bed beside her mother, telling a long, winding story about a bird she had seen from the window. Avelin was sorting napkins into neat little stacks. Alexa kept handing out fortune cookies and pretending to read everyone's future. Evan watched them all, his heart so full it felt almost painful. For years, he had believed success was measured in buildings, contracts, and awards. But now, in this small, sterile room filled with mismatched voices and warm food containers, he understood something much deeper. Success was this. This moment. This miracle. And whatever came next, he knew it would be built not on fear, not on distance, but on the fragile, powerful strength of 5 people who had finally found each other. The hospital discharged Malin 2 weeks after she first opened her eyes. Though her body was still weak, her mind was clear and focused, and her strength returned slowly with every passing day. Evan had arranged everything before the doctors even gave their final approval, an accessible apartment just a few blocks from the hospital, furnished with soft lighting, calming colors, and space for the girls to feel at home. He had hired a nurse to help during the transition, but only for the practical things. The emotional weight of reintegrating their family couldn't be outsourced, and he didn't want it to be. This wasn't about convenience. It was about responsibility. It was about love. Moving day wasn't extravagant. There were no moving trucks or photo ops. Just a quiet afternoon where Malin was wheeled out of the hospital with Evan walking beside her, the girls skipping ahead and opening every door like it was a castle. They had never had a home with all 5 of them inside it before. And though no one said it aloud, everyone felt the shift, the unspoken relief that for the first time, they wouldn't be sleeping in separate rooms across different floors, connected by tubes or hospital beds or visiting hours. They would wake up under the same roof, hear the same rain on the same windows, eat the same breakfast at the same table. Malin had moments of doubt, though she tried to hide them. Evan could see it in the way her hands fidgeted when she thought no one was looking, in the way she sometimes paused in doorways as if afraid she didn't belong in this new reality. He didn't press her. He just stayed close, folding blankets, setting plates, unpacking children's books, showing with his actions that he was here not for a day or a week but for good. And she watched him with the quiet caution of someone who had been left before but desperately wanted to believe this time was different. The girls adapted quickly. They had always been each other's constant, and now they had both parents around them in ways they had never experienced. Evan drove them to school every morning, sometimes still in his undershirt and slippers, hair messy from rushing to pack lunchboxes and find missing shoes. He loved it. He had never expected to love the chaos, the syrup spills, the bedtime debates about which storybook was best. But it made his life full in a way no achievement ever had. One night, about a week after the move, Evan found Malin sitting on the small balcony just outside the living room, wrapped in a light blanket, a cup of tea in her hands. The girls were asleep, finally, after hours of bouncing between laughter and tears. Recovery was not a straight line, and nightmares still came. He sat beside her, offering a gentle smile without speaking. They listened to the sounds of the city below, the muffled hum of traffic, a siren in the distance, the occasional bark of a dog. "I thought I could do it all," she said finally, not looking at him. "I thought if I just stayed strong, I could protect them. I didn't want them to grow up knowing their father didn't choose them. So I made the choice for you." Evan didn't interrupt. He let her speak, because it mattered. "I never stopped wondering," she continued. "What if I had told you? What if you had stayed? But then I watched you with them these last few weeks. And I realized something. If you had stayed back then, you wouldn't have been ready. But now, you are." He turned to face her fully, her eyes catching the soft gold of the streetlights. "I don't deserve forgiveness for what I missed. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life showing up anyway." "You already are," she whispered. He reached out and took her hand gently, fingers threading together like they had in another life, one that had been interrupted but not destroyed. For the first time in years, there was no space between them. No regret too wide to cross. Just the quiet presence of two people who had lived separate storms and now stood in the calm of something whole. Inside, a soft cry rang out from one of the bedrooms. Without a word, Malin moved to rise, but Evan stopped her with a small squeeze of her hand. "I've got it," he said. "You rest." He kissed her temple and stood, walking down the hallway with steady steps, already guessing which of the girls it was by the tone of the cry. Malin watched him disappear into the dark, a quiet smile on her lips, and something deep in her chest finally settled. This wasn't the life they had planned. It wasn't neat or simple. But it was real. It was theirs. And it was just beginning. Summer came gently, with warm breezes that carried the scent of fresh grass and the sound of children's laughter echoing from nearby parks. The new apartment had begun to feel lived in. The girls' artwork was taped proudly to the walls, each drawing signed in crayon with a shaky version of their names. Stuffed animals lined the back of the couch. Shoes piled messily at the entryway. It was far from perfect, but perfect wasn't the goal. It was home. And every part of it pulsed with the energy of a family rediscovering itself one day at a time. Evan's days looked different now. He still attended meetings, made decisions, ran his empire, but not without boundaries. He had handed over parts of the business to his trusted leadership team. He no longer chased growth for the sake of growth. If a call came in after 5, he let it wait. He didn't feel guilt for it. He felt gratitude. Every evening, he was home in time to help set the table, to hear about the girls' days at school, to kiss 3 foreheads goodnight. Every morning, he brewed 2 cups of coffee, one for him, one for Malin, and they'd stand in the kitchen watching the girls eat cereal and argue about who got to pick the music in the car. The healing didn't happen all at once. Malin had days where fatigue came over her like a fog. There were moments when the shadows of the past returned, quiet doubts that whispered whether this new life was real or simply borrowed. Evan had his own battles. The guilt never fully disappeared. But instead of pushing it away, they let each other feel it, speak it aloud, and then release it. It became something they carried together. One Sunday afternoon, they took a trip to the botanical gardens, a place Malin used to sketch in years ago. The girls ran ahead, chasing butterflies and dragging Evan to every fountain and sculpture with the same enthusiasm they once reserved for cartoons. Malin walked slowly beside him, her hand in his, her step steady now without needing help. They stopped on a wooden bench beneath an arch of climbing roses, and for a moment, watched the girls spin in circles under the dappled sunlight. "This feels like something I imagined when I was alone," she said quietly, not turning toward him. "But I never thought I'd actually live it." Evan looked at her, studying the line of her profile, the ease in her smile, the brightness returning to her eyes. "It doesn't feel imagined to me," he said. "It feels earned." The girls ran back toward them then, arms outstretched, hands full of tiny flowers and wild energy. They clambered onto the bench, one by one, squeezing into every inch of space until Malin was surrounded and laughing. Evan wrapped his arms around all of them at once, drawing them close, and for a long, quiet moment, there was no pain, no guilt, no past, just the present, held together by 5 hearts that had once been scattered but were now finally in sync. As the sun began to lower, casting long golden shadows across the gardens, Alexa turned to Evan and asked, "Are we always going to be like this now?" He smiled down at her, his voice low but sure. "We are," he said. "Because this is our forever." That night, back at home, the girls fell asleep tangled in each other's arms. Evan stood in the doorway and watched them, his heart full in a way he never thought possible. Malin stepped beside him, resting her head on his shoulder, and for a while, they said nothing. They didn't need to. Everything had changed, but not in the way that breaks. This change had built something new. Something lasting. In the quiet glow of the hallway, Evan reached for her hand again, and together they stood, steady and whole, knowing that these walls, these little voices, this shared love, was the story they were always meant to live. Not the perfect one, not the planned one, but the truest one. And it had only just begun. In my view, the ending of this story is deeply moving because it doesn't rely on grand gestures or dramatic finales. It finds its power in the quiet, everyday moments that make up real love and redemption. Evan's journey isn't about saving someone else to feel heroic, it's about confronting the version of himself he left behind and choosing, every single day, to become the father and partner he never thought he could be. The girls, once caught between trauma and uncertainty, are no longer just survivors, they're daughters who found their home. And Malin, after years of carrying everything on her own, is finally allowed to lean on someone and be loved without condition. What makes this conclusion so powerful is its truth. Healing doesn't erase the past, but it builds a future where the pain no longer defines you. It reminds us that families can be rebuilt from broken pieces, and that the most meaningful transformations are often the quietest. This is a story of second chances that feel earned, not given, and that's why it stays with you long after the final page.